Fair to say money can be a point of difference or even conflict in romantic relationships. So how do you and your partner deal with those differences? How do you negotiate joint responsibilities, savings, and splurges versus frugality? Dr. Lillian Nejad is a clinical psychologist. Welcome to Life Matters, Lillian.
Thank you very much, Beverly. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you here, and you're standing by to take the calls with me, hold everyone's hand, so to speak, telephonically. So let's talk about money and values. Where do those values around money come from?
Oh, well, they definitely come generally from your background, often based on what your family role modeled for you in terms of behavior, in terms of attitudes. And also it can be impacted by, the circumstances that were there while you were growing up. So, some people who come from a more affluent background might have very different ideas about money than somebody who struggled or saw their family struggle with their finances growing up. So all of those things can lead to different values and ideas about what money represents.
And of course, when you start a relationship, talking about money probably isn't really up high on the list. First, it's all about attraction,
Yes.
Are you compatible in all their ways? And I imagine that as the relationship crosses into more serious territory and you're pretty much in it already, that's when the conversation about money begins. So how tricky is that to become established as a couple and then come to that big money conversation?
Yeah, I think often it actually starts being very apparent, like what the different money styles are when you're living together in particular. And when you live together, you're adjusting on a lot of different levels. But money is something that often comes up as the strongest disagreement among couples. And it's actually increasing among millennial couples. A recent study found that 72% of millennial couples were concerned about debt and said that they frequently or occasionally argued about money.
And how often do you see people who tell you that arguments over money in their relationships is causing problems?
Yeah, it's fairly common. And I think often it represents not just different values about money, but just different values in general. So, yeah, so it can actually generalize to a lot of different areas.
Talk a bit more about that. How does the attitude towards money bleed into different areas where you might have conflict with your partner?
Well, if we think about, let's say, if you tend to be more of a spender than a saver, then your values may reflect that in other areas. You might like spontaneity, generosity, independence. You might value quality of life more than other things, whereas a saver might value caution and responsibility and collaboration and future security. So that can play out in all areas of your life.
Bear in mind, this isn't financial advice. We're talking about it in the realm of relationships and money. We have a text, actually, Lillian, if you wanted to respond to this one. Michelle's texting in saying that she and her husband had the same style, which was not good. Too much splurging and not enough planning. So in that case, not a clash, but two people with the same bad habits kind of spiraling together. What do you say to people in that situation?
Well, I think it's great that they have that self-awareness, because I think that that's where everyone needs to start, is like to really understand what their values are and how that impacts their behaviors. So fantastic that you know that already. And I think the next step is to have like a really open, honest conversation with each other and understand what your goals are, and how you actually are going to achieve those financial goals.
We're in a time where the cost of living is rising in Australia and all around us. It's something we're confronted with on nearly every front in our household expenses. So do you anticipate that at a time like this, more couples might be arguing about money? And if you are in a relationship where you feel like that tension is rising, how might you suggest monitoring that and addressing that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think with interest rate rises, it's going to cause a lot of stress and anxiety for everyone. And couples need to really think about how that impacts their kind of overall financial situation. And again, it's really important to be able to have these kind of honest conversations about, what's actually coming in, what's going out, and maybe looking into organizing your budget a little bit differently in light of what these changes are. And changes can come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. So it is really important to have these money conversations on a regular basis, because sometimes there are unexpected expenses. There are times where we might overspend a little bit more during, like, for instance, in December,
Yes.
for a lot of people. And then, also there are changes in, job and employment. So all of those things can impact your bottom line and then what you're actually able to do with your money.
Just going back to what you said earlier in the conversation about how your values around money are formed, when you are a child in your family. I'm just wondering, how does a person go about changing that attitude? For example, you might have grown up in a family where money was always tight, and so you had a sense of scarcity, but you could have gone on to, make a stable salary, and that is no longer the reality, but you might still have that mindset of scarcity. How do you begin to address acknowledging that what you experienced is no longer your reality and you can be different with money?
Yes, absolutely. I think step one is to do some self-reflection. Really understand thoroughly, like, who's influenced your attitudes about money and what those attitudes are. And that might be asking yourself, what did they say about money? What were their money behaviors? Were their values about money closely related to their personal values? Was there conflict about money, and who made the money decisions? And also things like, how was unpaid work valued in the home? Because that can often be part of financial issues and disputes among couples. And so when you are able to answer those questions, then you can really recognize how your money choices have been influenced by those factors. And then you can start acknowledging your own strengths and weak spots. And then you can make a choice to either, have the same mindset that you've developed, if you're happy with that, or to make changes to it.
Some really key questions to be asking yourself, Lillian Nejad. Thank you for that. Let's go to our first call. James, you and your partner are quite different. You are financially open, and your current partner is the opposite, very structured. So where does the talk to us a little bit about where the conflict arises when you have such contrasting attitudes towards money?
Yeah, sure. I'll just make sure you can hear me okay first.
We definitely can.
Fantastic. Thanks for the opportunity, and I really appreciate everything you guys are doing at ABC, and I hope it continues forever.
Thanks, James.
I as you said and mentioned, I'm quite fluid in my approach to finances and money decisions. I would have probably the closest approach to, I could say, is a Buddhist belief in that what goes around comes around, and good things come to good people. And that kind of mentality applies to anything in my life, inclusive of finances. I have been at financially the bottom of the barrel and floundering with the fish in different parts of the world and even in Australia over the last 10 years, but also around the world and work and travel. And I've also been at the top of the mountain financially, and I had the capability to, if I chose to, invest or try and buy a home or whatever have you. But I've never made what a financial advisor, I would say, would be the right choices at the right times.
And how does that?
I would say they were right for me in my life at that time, but financially possibly not.
Right. And James, how does that gel with your partner, who sounds like they're not the same way? Is that the source of conflict?
I don't know if it's a conflict yet. We've been together nearly 2.5 years, two and a little bit more. We love each other dearly. We recently moved in together into a property that she purchased herself within the last year or so. And we acquired some pets, and life was going good. It has its ups and downs, both financially and otherwise. I would say that her style and approach and her mentality and her self-accountability to herself and her finances is so inspirational, and she's obviously worked very hard to get to where she is and where she will be ongoing. And I would love to be more like her financially, but I would also like her to think somewhat more like me when it comes to certain ways of spending money and how and why.
Okay, so I want to bring Lillian in at this point. Lillian, we've heard the story of James and his partner. They're now working on having a long-term future together in an established home. As you hear the different attitudes, what's some advice you might give to James to keep in mind to approach some conversations about how they are going to keep the lines of communication open when it comes to finances?
Yes, James, I really love how you're already validating your partner's perspective about money and actually respecting it and wanting to emulate that to some degree, but still wanting to keep your values about money and maybe life in general in place. I think that that's really important as part of your, self-reflection, is to think about what your partner's perspective is and how is it the same and how is it different, and even why it might be different. And then think about potentially taking on their perspective and what it might feel like to have a partner who is freer with money and how that might impact the other person. And they can do the same, because I think that really deepens your understanding of the other person's concerns and needs and wants. And you can maybe come to a compromise that feels good for both of you.
James, is that helpful to you?
That's extremely helpful. I would have to just add on my own behalf. I can't speak on her behalf, though I'd never want to. On my own behalf, the women of the world, as a man myself, the women of the world are far and away the better humans, and she is one of the best in so many ways. And what you just said around perspective and the meeting of perspectives and doing it in a constructive and collaborative way, so that we're on a shared understanding as well as a shared direction in the future, is exactly what we've talked about just ourselves in the last week or two. But it's really nice to know and be reinforced that we are on the right track, and that we will continue taking more advice and listening to shows like yours and people like you to steer us in the right direction and make a bright, beautiful future. The last thing I would just add is happy NAIDOC week. Please get out and march today. And I love you all, ABC and Melbourne. Thanks.
James, thank you so much for your call, and best of luck to you and your partner. Let's go straight to Philip. Philip, you think that the conversation around money should start much younger to avoid these kinds of conflicts?
Look, I hope you're out there talking to schools and school children. I mean, even from an independent point of view, not from, let's say, an education teacher's point of view, which may not know a lot about finance or risk-taking money. It's the elephant in the room. It's the breaks marriages. It's like the sleeping giant conversation away from relationships of, I like you and you like me conversation. Next thing's money, because it will be the cause of probably, 50, 60, 70% of marriage breakdowns is all about money. And we just don't know enough from a young age that there are risk takers, there's savers, there's investors. And, really probably, I wish I'm over 60. So, James, well done. Look forward to your future and get some education around that whole concept of discussing it. I mean, we weren't allowed to discuss it at the table. That's ridiculous. And yet it's the breakdown point of most relationships.
It's interesting that you raise that talking about money is so taboo for some people, Philip. That's a really key thing, isn't it, Lillian? That even beginning to approach acknowledging the existence of money, and some of us have more and some of us have less, and we have different attitudes, that is already difficult in and of itself.
Completely agree with that. I think that most people are really hesitant to talk about money. We definitely don't talk about it freely among friends. It's often seen as an awkward or taboo subject to bring up. And definitely also agree that we, with Philip, about, educating children younger, not only to manage their money, but also just to be able to talk about it honestly. And then when you're in a couple and you need to have those conversations, you do have to accept and expect that the conversation about money will be challenging, especially at first, because we're just not used to it. But there is a way of having that conversation and being able to find solutions and compromise and respect each other in the process.
That's clinical psychologist Dr. Lillian Nejad, our guest this morning, as we take your calls on 1-300-222-5576 in the eastern states, 1-300-222-5576. Now, Lillian, before we move on to our next call, I think it's important to point out that there are aspects of conflict in relationships to do with finances which go into the territory of financial abuse and coercive control. So when might you be concerned about that conflict over money in a relationship is tipping into those harmful areas, and what would you advise?
Well, yeah, of course, it's a really important topic, and this is something that's kind of been hidden for a really long time, and thankfully coming out into the light. If you really feel that you don't have any respect or validation coming from your partner, that you are being controlled via your finances, that you're given potentially an allowance, and you don't have access to money for potential emergencies or things that come up. Any of those things can be a red flag. So it is really important to get help straight away. There are really good crisis lines and respect line that will help people who think that they might be in a situation where there is coercive control or domestic violence, and they can really help you through that process of safely managing that situation.
1-800-RESPECT.org.au. If you go to that website, there is a section on financial abuse. You can also call them on 1-800-737-732 if this conversation is raising any issues for you. We're focusing more on conflict that doesn't go into that realm, which is just in a relationship where you have arguments and tension about how much to spend and how much to save. But definitely, if you need that resource is available to you. Sue, talk a little bit about your money issue. You're single, but you get a lot of advice from a friend. How does that go?
Look, yes, I've been a single parent I'm in my 60s, for most of my, older life since my daughter was 5. So my money style is worry. I worry about money. I've always worried that I wouldn't, manage to bring up my daughter on my own. But I have a really good friend who you talk about not talking about money with friends. My friend knows everything about my financial situation. She comes to my house. She helps me figure out how where I should put my money, what I should do with it. I can say to her, "Look, am I okay?" I mean, I don't really know if because I'm actually a bit of a creative. I'm a singer-songwriter, and I don't have much of a sort of, I'm a right brain person, and she's a left brain person, and her advice is absolutely invaluable, and I trust her with all the information about my finances. I trust her completely, and she's a huge help to me.
That sounds like a great friend to have, Sue. So that's fantastic that you can have that resource. Thanks so much for your call. I'm just going to get to a text from Melbourne. This texter says, I earn almost double from my partner, but also am more of a saver and worry more about future financial security. I can't help but feel resentful that he isn't more similar to me with money. For example, prioritize higher paid work and future planning. Money is a real point of tension for us, especially when my partner is low on money. I'm worried about our future with the possible addition of a mortgage and kids. Our fights over money are the most stressful we have ever had. How can we get through this? Lillian, this person really needs some help. What can you say to them?
Yeah, look, I think you're talking about very different styles of life, probably, as well as money. I think sometimes it's really helpful if you've tried to have those conversations and they don't end up going well and you just end up arguing or feeling stressed or resentful. It can be really helpful to get some help. And that might come in the form of hiring a financial advisor. So there's an objective kind of person who is helping you with your budget and spending and your, saving towards your future mutual goals. It also might just be useful to think about a relationship counselor or therapist, because if partners are having conflicting values that impact multiple areas of their lives, that might be something a counselor can really help people discuss those things in a safe and neutral place.
Lillian, the texter points makes a very important point that people in relationships don't make the same amount of money, and that can sometimes be the fundamental conflict of feelings of what does fairness mean in a relationship where the incomes are not the same? What's your advice there?
Yeah, I think that is something that a lot of couples will struggle with. And part of it is also how are things, the work that we do that is outside of, employment, how is that valued in the relationship? Because that's often not, historically, it hasn't really been taken into account. But I think more and more people are valuing things like, all the planning that's done for the family or the partners, the cooking and the cleaning and the caring for children, whether it's done by, either partner, that holds some value. And so I think that it can be difficult if partners don't feel like everything is kind of shared and they're both contributing equally to the partnership, even if it's not financially equally.
We've got a call from Richard in Killara. Richard, you'd love to speak to Lillian about having those money conversations because you have a very different approach to money, or you keep your money separately with your partner, but you do want to have that conversation, but you're struggling?
Yeah. So my situation is like I am approaching 60 and we've been together, been married for a long time. And I've been thinking about it recently in terms of our separate backgrounds. We both came with parents where the mother was very structured and good with the money, whereas our fathers were collectively fairly reckless, and in my case it led to our parents divorcing and my wife's parents having a very unhappy marriage towards the end. But it kind of, I think it's affected influences our mindsets to money. We're not struggling. I'll be upfront about that. I own our house, and my wife is probably due to get an inheritance as well down the track, but we want to be able, I've tried to have these conversations with my wife as to how we should, sit down at the table and have some sort of planning, budgeting strategy. But I look at it from her point of view. She saw what happened with in her family, and she's very conservative and she's very wary of having, the notion of going to see a financial planner, for example, to sort of say, well, how should we structure our finances for the years ahead? We're approaching retirement and all of that. I also have a 19-year-old son, and we've got there's a separate issues there with him in terms of trying to educate him with regards to how to think about saving for his future. He's on the path of beginning his career and his life and his future. But yeah, it's really just around the how to handle those, how to go beyond our current situation where we could do better if we were to sort of be on the same page as to how to manage our finances. Yeah.
Just a follow-up question before Lillian takes over. I'm just curious, Richard, how you've managed decades in a relationship with somebody avoiding the money conversations. How do you make those big decisions if there's hesitancy to discuss money?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we don't not talk about it, but it's very tenuous and it's very guarded, I suppose. Like, for example, I bought our current house, and that's not a problem. And I've established a will, and I've tried to, and I've always tried to bring my wife into these discussions and let her understand. And she understands, and yes, she understands what needs to be done. But it's sort of spoken about, but it's not carried through. It's sort of like left in abeyance. And I just think there's a bit of just this. I think it's her again, it's just from her background, she's very wary about overcommitting overcommitting in terms of sharing, pooling our resources, I suppose, and in a way that we both are on, we both sort of know what we're going to do going forward. It affects us in terms of how we can plan for the future. For example, we sort of think about, well, do we want to have a retirement where we do this or that, and and in the end it all turns out. It all comes out as spontaneous, and we just sort of react to the moment and go off and do something which we probably could have done better if we had have planned it a little bit more.
Lillian, what are you hearing when you hear what Richard is describing? What might you recommend? What are the flags that are kind of waving about in this description?
Well, I think from what Richard is saying is that his partner's very anxious about talking about the details in terms of what the goals are and how to reach those goals financially. And when we feel anxious, we do tend to, avoid. That's just kind of everybody's go-to approach when we're feeling anxious about something. And so the way to reduce that anxiety, and this might seem counterintuitive, but it's to do the opposite of that. It's to approach what you feel anxious about and get used to having those conversations. And it might just be helpful, Richard, to start very gently, and maybe start in a place that you think she would feel the most comfortable, whether that's just what are your immediate goals, or what are your goals 5 years from now, in terms of like what you would like to save for, or how would you like to reduce debt, or are there investment goals that you have or goals for retirement that you have, and just keeping it at a goals level to start with, and then committing to having kind of these money conversations on a regular basis, and maybe having them more often in little bursts, like weekly for 10 minutes or something like that, might be a nice way of kind of exposure to those conversations. And it might reduce that anxiety over time so that you can actually delve into things a little bit more.
Richard, wishing you all the best. Good luck to you. Let's go to Gail in Brisbane. You've been through 2 different money styles and 2 different relationships. Tell us about your situation.
Hi, Beverly. Thanks for taking my call. Yeah, so my my marriage was a very controlling marriage to a very unpleasant guy for 11 years. I had no control over my money, and when that relationship ended, I became a single mum for 20 years, and now I'm in a relationship with an extraordinarily lovely bloke. But I'm naturally very cautious, having been a single mum, used to counting my pennies, used to saving away, constantly stunned and amazed when, I've got savings. And my partner just loves to spend. And, he gets a little bit of extra money, at tax time or whatever, and it's gone before you know it, which is fine. So we've just decided to keep our money separate. And we talk about it all the time. We have these conversations, and open, upfront conversations. But, his money's his and my money's mine, and never the twain shall meet.
And when you entered into this new relationship, Gail, did you have a money conversation up front? How did the conversations about money begin? How did you start to notice that you had very different approaches to money?
We were pretty upfront to begin with, because we had known each other previously. So we already knew each other before we got into this relationship, and we because it was the second significant relationship for both of us, we were decided from the get-go that it was important to just communicate really clearly and really well with each other about everything. So that was a really good jumping-off point, and it was a lot of the conversations happened around habit, about what we were doing. And noticing each other's habits, and that would start a conversation. Like I would buy a loaf of sourdough. Don't mind spending $7.50 for a loaf of sourdough. My partner would be like, I find they go off, and I'm just looking at him going, well, you're insane. You slice it this way and you put it in the freezer for later. And he's like, that had never occurred to me. So, you have those conversations, and that leads on to another conversation about waste and about, what you want to do with your money. So I think it's just having those open lines of communication and acknowledging that there are going to be differences. Neither is right or wrong, but just talk.
Gail, it's great to hear that you're in a much better place now than you were in your previous relationship. Have you got a question for Lillian about how to keep going in a positive direction with your current partner?
It sounds like Gail's doing really well.
yeah, look, we are, but and I think, I've been listening to my daughter and her partner, and they, again, have different types of spending habits. And sort of, I suppose, what would be your best advice for young couples? Is it to keep, or new couples that are getting together, is it to communicate? Is it to, what's the best advice for young couples or your new couples to go forward?
Yeah, look, I think step one is to understand yourself and what your values are and what your behaviors are around money. And then two is exactly what you have been doing, which is having those conversations. Whether they seem awkward or challenging at first, they're really worth having. And the way that you have those conversations, because what you're saying, Gail, is that you really had respectful conversations, that you validated your partner's values and attitudes and perspectives and style with money. And then you were able to focus on a solution, and you found one that works for you. So I think that sounds like an excellent way to go.
Gail, thank you so much for calling in. Lillian, when it comes to young couples, new couples, what do you think about the idea of asking to see your partner's financials? Is that a good idea, or perhaps not?
It depends what phase you are in the relationship. I guess I don't think you want to do that on date one, but if you're in a serious relationship, I think that, again, trying to take that taboo off of the conversations about money is important, especially if you are in a partnership where you have access to each other's money. Part of the conversation that you can have is about how much you earn, how much money you have, what you save, what your assets look like. And that can inform the rest of the conversation in terms of what your immediate goals are, your goals, in a year and 5 years. And then how you want to take those goals and priorities into account. So that you can create a budget or a system that works for both of you.
Let's head to Tasmania now, where Anka has called in. What's your advice that you want to share through your experiences?
My advice. It's just, I'm going to use a broad stroke generalisation. I think it's part of being an adult. It's time to adult and recognise your money issues, if you have any issues. If you're in a relationship with anyone, it's just part of being an adult. What I really wanted to mention was about when you're going through a divorce. That's always a pretty hot topic about money and assets. I really strongly advise, if anyone is going through a divorce and where it's possible, extricate yourself from lawyers and solicitors and whatnot, and work it out amongst yourself. Even if you just see red every time you see the other person, if it's at all possible, limit that advice, because that intrusion of a third party, because a lot of money goes to them, and all that hard work and all that savings mean nothing in the end. Mean nothing in the end. It's only, I feel it's vindictive if you take, a person to court because you don't like them anymore and go, right, I'm going to get every little cent. That doesn't serve a purpose for anybody. Both parties lose in the end. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you for your call, Anka. And Lillian, Anka makes a good point that the money conversation will continue past the end of the relationship sometimes.
Yes, that's true. And divorce and settlements and all of that can be an extremely stressful, fraught experience for couples and for families. And some people will be able to negotiate without getting legal advice or having lawyers involved. That might not be possible for other couples whose communication has broken down or where there's been other issues like coercive control as part of it. I'd say if you are really stressed through that process, it's completely understandable and common, then it can be really helpful and a great investment to seek assistance and see a psychologist or somebody that can help you through that stress.
Dr. Lillian Nejad, I want to thank you so much for taking calls with me this morning on Life Matters. Lillian is a clinical psychologist. You can find her online. We'll put that link up on the Life Matters program page later. Now, on the text line, many of your texts flowing in on this topic. Here's one. My partner and I, together 20 years, simply talk about what we want to do in life. Nitpicking over money has never been an issue. It's a tool, not a thing. Life and what you do with the resources at your disposal to achieve quality of life are central. And Harry has texted that he and his wife have been married for nearly 30 years, started out with very difficult values on money, but over the years, however, their views have moved closer together. So that's wonderful. And thank you for your text, Harry. Now, if this discussion today has raised bigger issues around coercive control and money, please do call 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732 or go to their website, 1-800-RESPECT.org.au.
ABCRN helps you understand the world. Find more of our stories on the ABC Listen app.